Chapter 1, The Tenants of Greystone. Greystone Manor stood like an aging giant, its dark stone facade looming over the narrow street. Nestled in the heart of an old city, the building had once been a grand estate, but now it was divided into shabby apartments. People came and went, but they never stayed long. A transient place. A place with secrets. Isabel Caine was new to the city, her life uprooted after a nasty divorce. She needed a fresh start, and Greystone Manor, with its low rent and convenient location, seemed perfect. The landlord, a hunched and taciturn man named Mr. Grimley, handed her the keys with a grim smile that never reached his eyes. His warning echoed in her mind long after she signed the lease. Greystone has been here a long time, Miss Caine. Some say it was built on cursed ground. Don't mind the noises. The walls, they're thin. She brushed it off. Old buildings made noise. Creaks, groans, drafts through loose windows. It was part of the charm, she told herself. But something about the building felt off the moment she stepped inside. The hallways were dark, the floors uneven, and the air carried the weight of forgotten years. Isabel's apartment, on the third floor, was sparsely furnished, but clean. It smelled faintly of mildew and something else, something metallic, like old pennies. She wrinkled her nose but shrugged it off. The day passed without incident as she unpacked, trying to make the cold, impersonal space feel like home. Yet, as night fell, the shadows in the corners deepened unnaturally. That first night, Isabel lay awake in bed, eyes wide open. She wasn't sure what had woken her, but the quiet was absolute, almost oppressive. Her ears strained for any sound, anything to break the silence. And then, there it was. A faint shuffling from the hallway outside her apartment. It was soft, like bare feet dragging against the hardwood floor. She sat up, holding her breath. The sound stopped just outside her door, then nothing. Isabel crept to the door and peered through the peephole. Nothing but darkness. She pressed her ear against the door, heart racing, listening. The silence stretched on until her pulse slowed. She convinced herself it was just a neighbor, maybe returning home late. But as she turned to head back to bed, she noticed something chilling. The faint outline of a handprint on her door, smeared in what looked like dust, or something darker. Chapter 2, Whispers in the Walls. Days passed, and Isabel settled into a routine. The city kept her busy, and during the day, Greystone Manor felt almost normal, even quaint in its old-world charm. But nightfall brought with it a deep, creeping unease. The shuffling in the hallway returned, always just outside her door, and now there were whispers, faint, unintelligible, but distinctly there. She asked her neighbors if they'd heard anything strange, but most were indifferent or evasive. Mrs. Hutchins, an elderly woman who lived directly below Isabel, was the only one who spoke of it. Her eyes, milky and clouded with age, glinted with something like fear. You hear them, don't you? The ones in the walls. Her voice was a rasp, each word a struggle. They've been here long before us. Before this building was even raised. This place, it wasn't meant to house the living. Isabel shivered, but forced a smile. It's just an old building, Mrs. Hutchins. Old buildings creak. The old woman shook her head. It's not the building, child. It's what's inside it. That night, Isabel found it harder to sleep. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The shadows in her apartment felt thicker, as though they clung to the walls, watching. She tried reading, distracting herself with a novel, but the whispers returned, faint and insistent, like voices carried on a cold breeze. They seemed to come from the walls themselves, whispering in languages she couldn't understand. Isabel pressed her ear to the wall, her breath shallow. For a moment it was as though something on the other side was breathing back, a low, guttural sound, heavy with malice. She jerked away, heart pounding, and flicked on every light in the apartment. Something was terribly wrong in Greystone Manor. Chapter 3, The Hidden Room. Determined to find an explanation, Isabel spent the next day digging into the building's history. The local library was her first stop, and what she uncovered sent chills down her spine. Greystone Manor had a dark past. The land it stood on had once been a burial site, long before the city had grown around it. In the 1800s, the manor had been home to a wealthy but reclusive family, the Morrows. Tragedy had struck when every member of the family had disappeared without a trace. Local legend whispered that the house had consumed them, that the ground itself was cursed, hungry for the souls of the living. Isabel dismissed most of it as superstition, but the more she read, the more uneasy she became. Every few decades, the building changed hands, and each owner met a grim fate: suicides, disappearances, madness. That evening, as Isabel returned to her apartment, she felt the weight of the building pressing in on her, its darkened windows like eyes watching her every move. She had to know what was behind the noises, the whispers. Driven by desperation, she began to explore the building, starting with the basement. The basement was a dark, cavernous space, filled with the scent of damp concrete and decay. As she shined her flashlight around, something caught her eye: a door hidden behind a stack of old, rotting boxes. It was small and unmarked, almost as if someone had tried to conceal it. Her hands trembled as she reached for the knob. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow passage that led into the belly of the building. The air was colder here, and the walls seemed to pulse, almost as if they were alive. At the end of the passage was a small room, its walls covered in strange symbols. In the center of the room was an old iron chair, rusted and chained to the floor. And beside it, a collection of brittle bones. Isabel backed out of the room, her breath coming in short gasps. She could hear the whispers again, louder this time, echoing through the passage like a chorus of the dead. She fled back to her apartment, slamming the door behind her, but the whispers followed. Chapter 4: The Eyes of the Manor. Sleep became impossible. Every night, the noises grew louder, more insistent. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows taking on grotesque, shifting forms. Isabel was no longer alone in her apartment. She could feel them, eyes watching her from every corner, from behind the walls. They whispered her name, drawing her deeper into the nightmare that Greystone had become. One night, she heard the shuffling again, only this time it wasn't in the hallway. It was inside her apartment. Frozen with fear, she turned her head slowly towards the living room. There, standing in the corner, was a figure, a shadow, humanoid but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head twisted at an unnatural angle, and its eyes, they glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. Isabel screamed, backing away, but the figure didn't move. It simply watched, its mouth opening wide in a silent, grotesque grin. She ran to the door, her fingers fumbling with the locks, but before she could escape, the shadow was gone. The apartment felt suffocating, as though the walls were pressing in, alive with the malevolent presence that now stalked her every move. Desperate, she called the police, but when they arrived, the figure was gone, the apartment quiet. The officer who came took one look at her pale, trembling form and gave her a knowing nod. "You're not the first," he muttered under his breath, glancing nervously at the walls. "Get out while you still can." Chapter 5: The Final Tenant. Isabel didn't sleep that night. She couldn't. Her every instinct screamed to leave, to run as far from Greystone as possible. But when morning came, she found herself unable to move. Something held her here, something ancient and dark, a force that had rooted itself in the very foundation of the building. She decided to confront it. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and sheer desperation, Isabel descended once more into the basement, back to the hidden room. The air was thicker now, the walls almost breathing with a low, rhythmic pulse. Inside the room, the iron chair seemed to beckon her. The bones scattered on the floor shifted as though disturbed by an unseen hand. And in the corner, where the shadows were deepest, she saw them, figures, dozens of them, trapped in the walls, their mouths open in silent screams. The whispers grew louder, deafening now, and the figures reached for her with skeletal hands, their eyes pleading for release. Isabel backed away, but her foot caught on something. She stumbled, falling against the wall, her hand brushing the symbols carved into the stone. A sudden jolt ran through her, and the room began to spin. The walls rippled, and for a moment, she saw it, an ancient presence, something dark and hungry, waiting just beyond the veil of reality. It had been here all along, feeding on the tenants of Greystone, consuming their souls. Isabel tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness. As the shadows closed in, she realized the terrible truth: she was now part of the house. Another tenant, lost to the whispers in the walls. Greystone Manor stood silent once more, its windows dark, its secrets buried deep. But inside, the walls whispered, waiting for the next tenant to arrive.